William Shakespeare. He is the bard, which means the poet. That's his nickname. He's born at Stratford-upon-Avon. That's also where he retires, outside of London. He's an educated young man. He learns Latin at an early age, and he begins as an actor in the theater world and learns the trade, and then becomes a playwright later. Anne Hathaway, not the gorgeous one, but the other one is his wife. He has kind of an unhappy marriage. He's actually forced to marry her. And in his will, he leaves her his second best bed. He has several children. His son, Hamnet, his name probably looks familiar, dies by drowning. Then his two daughters, later in life, he appreciates them more. He has a better relationship with them. And we see that in his plays like King Lear. Retirement. He's well off, but he's not published because this isn't the time of publishing plays. It's the time of performing plays. So much later, his buddies all get together and they produce what is kind of the book of the day, which is a folio, the first folio. And they have to get all the bits and pieces of his plays together and publish them. And of course, there's a lot of controversy now, a lot of conspiracy theories out there about did Shakespeare really write them, because they were published well after his death. And there are versions of them. We're not sure what's the right version. Like Hamlet has this really long version to it, and so the Hamlet that we generally perform and read today is one that is abridged. The Globe is the theater most often associated with Shakespeare. It's built around 1600. He was part owner in the Globe, but there were other venues. There's the Swan Theater that was kind of a rival to the Globe. You would see a diagram of London from that time. They're right next to each other. And then banquet halls could serve as theaters. So Twelfth Night, we know, was performed at a banquet hall. So here's a diagram of the Globe, what we think it might have looked like. We don't know for sure because we just don't have a lot of information. But this is a very unique kind of theater. It's kind of based off of a courtyard. That was the tradition that Elizabethan theater came out of, was street theater. So it's like putting the street in the theater. These are the cheap seats, the pit, where the groundlings would stand. And then if you pay a little bit more, you get into the first level of gallery. You pay more, you get into the second level. We have obviously the balcony where Juliet would be waiting for Romeo. Here it's not seen, but we would have a trap door, like Hamlet's father, the ghost, might come out of a trap door. Trapdoors are still in use today. And then up here we have the heavens, because we're very literal about things. We have to have the heavens. And up here is the flag. So we might have a black flag flying if we're going to show a tragedy that day. We might have a white flag if there's a comedy being presented that afternoon. In the back of the theater there, we don't see huge scenic elements. That's kind of happening somewhere else in the world. That's happening in the Italian Renaissance with the perspective painting that's going on, that's dazzling the audiences. That is not happening in Shakespeare's England. This curtain back here, though, is called the arras. So this joke that every English schoolboy knows. Where did Polonius get stabbed? In the arras. Source material. So all of his plays are drawn from pre-existing stories. Romeo and Juliet comes from a legend. Plautus is a Roman playwright. Shakespeare is schooled in Latin, so he takes Brothers Menechmi by Plautus, and he makes the Comedy of Errors out of it. And this is a mistaken identity play. Mistaken identity comes up a lot in Shakespeare's plays. One thing he was fond of is playing with the idea of males playing females, because all of his actors were males, but then playing males again. In Twelfth Night, we have Viola, who has to masquerade as a male. So he took advantage of that little quirk in his own theater of his own time that he didn't know would kind of cause us a headache later. We wouldn't quite get it later. All right. The tragedy is kind of the staple of theater at this point. That's considered the most noble form of theater, and really the major form of literature. This is kind of before the novel, so the tragedy was the thing. Of course, we have the Greeks writing tragedies and performing them, a few Roman tragedies going on, and then some things happening in Italy. But really, it's not until Shakespeare that we have the tragedies that rival the plays of Sophocles and Aeschylus of Greece. So we have the five-act structure. He knows exactly what a tragedy is. He gets the tragic hero. Um, and then there are subgenres of the tragedy. So Hamlet is a revenge tragedy, and it has things that a revenge tragedy would have, like suicide, incest, ghost, poison, all those things that you might see like in the Spanish tragedy. And revenge, gotta have revenge in Hamlet. And then you have comic relief. That was a big no-no in the Shakespeare, or not in Shakespeare's time, but in um, Greece, there were rules regarding tragedy. You didn't mix tragedy and comedy. That was a huge no-no. After Shakespeare's day, in France, it was a big no-no to mix comedy and tragedy. Shakespeare, he didn't care. That's one of the reasons his plays endure, because he knew how to write a play. And so Hamlet's too heavy, just the way it is. So you have to have something else happening at some point. So you have to have the gravedigger coming out just when everything's getting horrible and provide a little bit of comic relief, even though it is gallows humor and it's very dark. Comedies, obviously the opposite of tragedy, but kind of patterned after tragedy. His really range. So his comedies could be very, very lighthearted, like Love's Labour's Lost is a very, very lighthearted comedy. And then sometimes you get a little more serious, like The Tempest and Measure for Measure get a little more serious. And also a play like Measure for Measure kind of straddles both comedy and tragedy. Again, a big no-no. You can't do that in the Greek world, can't do it later in the French world, like in the period, the century after Shakespeare, but he went ahead and broke those rules. And those plays kind of defy category in a way, because maybe something tragic happens in them, but they're not tragedies. Another subgenre of the comedy is a pastoral. As You Like It is a pastoral, has kind of a rustic setting. It's about love, love in all its guises, and the boy trying to win the girl's heart or marry the girl, and then in the end, he finally is able to win the girl. I believe this one is also has the mistaken identity, and we have the boy playing a girl playing a boy. I think that's happening in this one. And a romance, that's another subgenre. Um, that would be like The Tempest, where we have the heavy element of the supernatural. The lead character is a sorcerer, and we have folklore. We have sort of ideas that come from newly discovered North America in happening in there. And it's very epic scale. So the storyline, even though we just get a glimpse of it, it starts much earlier than the actual play. And then the problem play, I think I mentioned Measure for Measure. Um, every play, of course, has to have a problem. It has to have a conflict. But a problem play looks at maybe something that's happening in society. So Measure for Measure is a look at tyranny and a look at a duke who has too much power. And in the end, it's not really solved, the fact that he has too much power. The history. Okay, that's the third big genre. The first big one is tragedy. The second big one is comedy. The third one is the history. So these are the plays that usually celebrate England's history. We could kind of put Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar in the histories, but really we're looking at the Henrys and the Richards there because they're the English monarchs. And he does this very shrewdly because you gotta make good with the royalty. You gotta like have friends everywhere. So he embellishes these and kind of whitewashes them a little bit in the name of patriotism. So he is self-censoring, and of course, people love their own history. So these plays are wildly popular at the time. The Apocrypha. So every playwright has his his turkeys. He had his turkeys. Sometimes these are the plays that are erroneously attributed to Shakespeare, or they can just be the plays so bad. Two Nobles Kinsmen, Titus Andronicus. No, that one's coming back, Titus Andronicus. But these plays, we just don't talk about them because they're just not up to Shakespeare's level. Blank verse. Shakespeare writes, of course, in verse because that's the expectation of the playwrights at the time, and blank verse is unrhymed. And pentameter, we're going to talk about in just a little bit exactly what that means. Not all of it is unrhymed, so we do have some rhyme that happens. A rhyming couplet is very common. Also in A Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet, those are two of his really early plays. And he's very tied to poetic devices in those plays, and we have a lot of rhyme happening in both of those, but not all the way through. I don't know why. Where it stops rhyming and starts, I don't even know why, but it does appear all of a sudden. An I am. So that's the most common type of foot that's happening. We're going to look very closely at an I am and what a foot means. But here is one example. It is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Da-da. So most words, the two-syllable words, really are trochees. Your name, if it's a two-syllable name, it's probably a trochee. So that's one way to tell the difference between the two. It's kind of rare that somebody's name is an I am. My name is August. The first syllable is accented, and then the second syllable, ust, is not. Louder. Loud is accented or stressed, and then the is not. He prefers the I ams, but he uses trochees quite often, and we'll look at examples of both of them. One more thing about this, that when we have a line of I ams and we insert a trochee or another kind of foot, that's called a substitute foot. And that kind of helps break things up a little bit, so it's not so monotonous. Okay, so we're going to analyze both of these lines. This one is from Julius Caesar. This little accent mark there, this little backwards one, that means that we're going to pronounce that as a syllable. So it's not shamed, it's a shamed. He does that whenever he wants to buy himself a syllable. He kind of cheats a little bit. So let's count the syllables. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 is right, because if we are going to break this into 5 feet, 5 iams, we should have 10 syllables. And in just a second, we'll see what that looks like. This one is not quite as long. It's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's 8 syllables long. So we know that it's not going to be in pentameter, which we'll talk about in just a second. It's going to be in another kind of meter. Also, do we have the same feet going on between them? We're going to look at that. So this first one is broken into stressed syllables and unstressed syllables. The lighter words or syllables are the accented ones. So here we have, I am ashamed I did yield to them. The first foot that we're looking at is the first two words, I am. And that's a good way to remember what an I am is. Just remember this line, I am ashamed I did yield to them. The first one is unstressed. The second one is stressed. The foot does not have to be a word. In this case, it's 2. In the second foot, the syllables aren't even a whole word. They're just a part of one word. So it's all about syllables. It's not about words. And then the other thing I want to point out is by the time we get to the fifth foot, we have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. And this is kind of the typical ending of a line that's in perfect iambic pentameter. And because it ends on a stressed syllable, we say that this is a masculine ending. If it ended on an unstressed syllable, this one does, then it's a feminine ending. I pointed out before that he is not always slavish to his I ams. They don't always go this way. In fact, arguably this line does not go da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He'll insert different feet in there. So maybe he'll take one of these feet and turn it around with the words that he chooses. So that it's I am, trochee, I am, or it's I am, spondy, I am. And that kind of breaks things up a little bit so that the meter does not get monotonous. Okay, so this is the preferred one. Pent meaning like pentagram or pentagon. That's the Greek root meaning 5. And so we have 5 iams. Down here we have tetra. Think of the game Tetris, where you have boxes coming down, four-sided boxes. Tetrameter, Tetris. That means that there are 4 feet in a line. And these feet, as you can tell, they're switched around. So we are actually beginning with the accented syllable and then going on to the unaccented one. So this is a trochee. If we shadows have offended. And of course, it has the feminine ending there. Now, this is the closing speech from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Puck delivers this. And this is why it's important. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, we have spells and incantations happening all the time. And Shakespeare wants to draw attention to them. So the whole thing is one big poem. He has to make these spells even a little more of a poem. So they look very poetic. If he shortens the line from 5 feet to 4, it actually puts the rhyming words closer together. And down here we have mended. If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended. It sounds more rhymey, obviously because we're rhyming, and the rhyming words are closer together. So it makes it sound a little bit more like a spell. And also we're throwing the audience out of the pentameter by using the tetrameter, and we're doing something else. Okay, so the play is not the only form, the only genre that he writes in. He also writes many famous sonnets, of course. Sonnets are also in iambic pentameter, and the rhyme scheme of those is as follows. It's the A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D. So we have kind of interwoven rhyme happening, not rhyming couplets until the very end. And we're going to study poetry and the rhyme scheme of a sonnet in another place, but I just wanted to mention it. And then he also has narrative poetry, like Venus and Adonis is one of his famous narrative poems that is not really a play at all. All right, that is Bill Shakespeare in a nutshell. All's well that ends well. Let me know if you have any questions.